Today we're talking about the Ink War, Romanticism versus Modernity in Chess. Another subtitle might be The Life and Times of Steinitz and Zukertort. Now, I find that this genre of book is really lacking for us as chess players. And what I mean by that is a history of chess players. Who were they? What were they about? What was their life like? And at the deepest level, what I want as a chess player is kind of a meditation on what is chess. Now, it might sound kind of philosophical, but I think it is an important question to ask, and it does vary through history, the answer that you give. For example, in my own lifetime, we had chess before the computer and chess after the computer, a completely different game. Before the computer, we have the highest players of the world being thought of as kind of priests to a higher truth that rarely made mistakes. And that's completely blown apart. There's an entire, that hierarchy is blown apart by the computer, and the computer is simply better than us. Completely different ballgame about what we're doing. And I could speak at length on it, but for me, this book is very interesting because it helps me think about, really, on a deeper level, what is chess, just by looking at what it was for these players more than 100 years ago. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is, I think, why this kind of book is hard to write. So first, from the author's perspective, you need somebody who is good at going through old archives, reading old stuff, fluent in several languages, an academic of sorts. At the same time, that person has to be at least reasonably good at chess, and it's hard to marry those two people, right? The next problem is for the reader, because let's say I'm reading a chess book. Well, then I'm going to have the book in front of me, a little bit to the side. I'm going to have my board out, and I'm going to be thinking deeply about what's happening, and then I'm going to be looking at what the book says. It's entirely different if I'm reading history. There, I'm going to be sitting in a chair, right? I'm going to be sitting in a chair, and I'm going to be just thinking about it, and I don't really want to get up when I've got this book in my hand and then go put a position on the board. So, but that's necessary, of course, for this kind of thing. You want to talk about the lives of the players, but also the moves they made. And I'd say a basic critique of this book, and I've seen this in others, is like trying to bring too much chess in. Like in this book, oh my God, they've got exercises that you're supposed to do. And I blame that on New Chess more than anything else, who is the editor in this case. And in fact, for myself, I just did a video about Steinitz Jagor in 1892. And for me, it's very separate. If I'm going to talk about chess, I'm going to do chess and there's going to be a board. If I'm going to talk about something like this, well, no, I'm not going to have a board, right? So they need to be together, and it's very hard to bring those together, right? And who are you writing the book for then, especially if you're going to talk about very deep chess concepts? So I think that's a big problem. Now, let me talk again a little bit more about what's interesting to me about this book and this kind of writing, and in particular, the meditation on what is chess. So first, two things that aren't in the book that I think would be very interesting. I want to know more about money, right? There's very little about money in the book, and that's maybe partly because the sources didn't tell our author, Willy Hendrik, much about it. But I think it's very interesting when you have a player, you have to make it through life, and if you're going to continue doing chess, you have to find some way to monetize it, right? And it's fascinating to me in this era where there's no reference to people giving lessons, right? There's references to playing matches for odds. You play a chump and you give them a knight or something like that. Try to make a little money that way, maybe a little bit of money writing. But in general, it's very unclear to me how these people were making money, very unclear. The next thing that I wanted to hear more about relating to the question of what is chess really is, this period is just dominated by Jews. We're talking about Zukertort, Steinitz, Tarasch, Lasker, all these German Jews, and what's going on there? So we got to say something. We got to say something in the same way that if we're talking about chess now, we'd want to talk about, like, well, what's going on with India, man? What can we say about it? Something interesting culturally is happening. Okay. Something that I think the easiest way to put yourself into this time period is to first imagine chess without ratings. And I think this gets to the heart of what is chess. I'm going to go ahead and say that chess without ratings is a fundamentally different game than with ratings. So in this period, with people who don't have ratings, it's not clear who's on top. Also in this period at the beginning, there's no world champion yet, right? Steinitz is going to be number one. And there's a whole battle. He starts saying he's world champion before he's really convincingly world champion, before there's a world championship match, right? And so you've got all kinds of crazy things. And how do people then, there's going to be a struggle of how do you distinguish yourself without a rating, right? One is to say that you've got new ideas. And that's what Steinitz is going to be all about, right? He's going to say, I've got this modern school, bro, and it's really cool, and I'm doing things on the board that Morphy didn't do, you know? And the other people are obviously all going to say, Morphy was the greatest, right? So that's the backdrop for the conflict between what we could call Romanticism and modernism. And one of the interesting things for me about the book was really when you think about it, these schools of thought are really, in some ways, not for the players, but for the fans. They need some kind of label for these different kinds of players. But the players need the label to advance their own interests because there's no rating system and they want to say, look how great I am. And I'm going to maybe monetize that by writing about it and you caring about what I say. So we have, for example, Romanticism, modernism, and then later hypermodernism. And then what I think would happen is that after we have both a world championship and a rating system, we don't have schools of thought anymore. Long before the computer came, people were stopped talking about schools of thought. They might have said hypermodern openings or something like that, but they weren't talking about schools of thought anymore. And I think that's deeply tied to not having a rating and at the beginning not having a world championship. Okay. One of the things that's fascinating about the story is that Steinitz was a jerk, dude. He was an absolute ass. And one of the things about conflicts in history outside of the chess world, too, of course, is that if you're an ass, the conflict is going to just be incredibly magnified. I think the classic example for that is Galileo. If Galileo hadn't been such a jerk, the whole Copernican thing wouldn't have been nearly as divisive as it became. Right? And in this case, it's going to be a battle where the people who hate him because he says all this stupid stuff and is such a pompous ass are going to say Morphy was better. And then it's just going to turn into what the book is called, the Ink War. Now, again, I think part of that is he needs a way to puff himself up. He needs a way to distinguish himself, right? To say, I'm world champion and I'm the bearer of these new ideas and I'm not trying to knock down everybody else who says otherwise. I think it has to do with money in a lot of ways. The other thing that's hilarious is, like, because there's no rating system, there's people like making up games to show how clever they were, like games that probably weren't even played against Steinitz. So like, I crushed this fool back in the, back in the salon in 1812, or not 1812, but you know what I mean. So people are making up stories, and there's this whole bitter warfare going on outside of chess. And also really important, we think about what is chess, like like this hyper descriptive notation was being used. They did not have algebraic. They did not have what's called modern descriptive. You have these whole paragraphs of Steinitz being like, oh, you know, I move the queen in front of the knight, and then the knight goes in front of the pawn, and it's like, who's going to follow that? Very difficult to do. And then they have these wars about annotation. And so one of the things we ask, like, what is chess? For them, a big part of it is like analyzing a position and coming to what you feel is a supreme positional understanding and calling the other guy a chump, you know? And so they have these little battles about who's right and who's wrong in these positions. Fascinating, totally different world, right? Totally different world. And now, you know, we talk about sometimes positional understanding, but it's not like it was before the computer. Now, if anything, your positional understanding is just reflected in your rating, you know, or the player you once were, or something like that. Another important thing that the book does is describe the madness that Zukertort falls into after, not madness, but he falls apart after the World Championship match. And this, you know, hurts his legacy, but also I think is really interesting in that it shows how the World Championship match in this first one, which went is brutal, New York, St. Louis, then to New Orleans, you know, brutally long match, and it just cracked this dude. And so we have somebody it's the first World Championship match and somebody's getting cracked. Magnus, buddy, you got to come back. It's a beautiful thing. You're going to the limit. All right. Steinitz, and we talked about this on our podcast about world champions going insane, really is this first model that we see again and again and again, all the way up to Kramnik now, of world champions becoming incredibly pompous and believing that they can speak outside the realm of chess. And when we ask what is chess, part of it is the belief that you're doing something intellectual, especially at that time, that's higher than everybody else, right? And therefore you are a deep thinker, you are this amazing person, and you therefore have the ability to speak about anything with absolute confidence, right? It's still going on today, but then it was more of a, like I said before the computer, there was more of a priestly tone to the thing, right? Only a couple people were allowed to talk about it in Steinitz's view, right? The other people, for example, some poor dude writes an opening book that wasn't up to his standards. Oh, he ripped the guy apart. Did not have the right to be doing that, right? Okay, so there it is. I think a pretty good book about this period of time. And like I said, I want more of books like that. A book I really enjoyed, for example, John Donaldson's Bobby Fischer and His World. Fantastic. It's very difficult, like I said, to write that kind of book. And there's only a couple, the readership for it is small, which makes it more difficult to publish. But I'm still very thankful that they exist, and I'm hoping more come along. Bye.